The reason for these enormous handouts is partly it's a Manhattan issue. In Manhattan, people want to feel they got their money's worth, and therefore they want big wads of material. Actually, I found that what I can do is I can give you orientation to the material. I can take you through pieces of it. Then when you ask questions, very often the answers are in the material, which is pretty helpful. And very often if you go home afterwards and read the whole material, which is long but not incredibly long, you very often can consolidate the things you heard and make the experience better. Okay? So the first thing should say a case study of urban church planting. Now, even if you're not planting a church, and even if you're not in an urban setting, I think I'd like to share with you something about what happened in planting a church in Manhattan for this reason. I use the word in all my talks. I use the word postmodern. Now, I'm not here to talk too much about what that is, as opposed to whether it's the modern. I'm not here to talk about whether that's a good word, but I'm here to say something we all recognize, that non-Christians of my parents' age and non-Christians of my age are very different than non-Christians of my kids' age, who are all in their 20s at this point. We all, I think, recognize across the spectrum that there are some changes in the culture, that younger people are less rational, less objective, and that's not, by the way, a negative. It's not a criticism. They are more oriented to narrative. They are more communal. I mean, they're all the things that you've read about. I'm not here to talk too much about that. There's just so many books on postmodern ministry being written. I'm here simply to say this. I went to New York City. I started a church. When I started the church, I was 38 and everybody else was 28 out there. Now I'm 53 and everybody else is still 28 out there, which is a little disconcerting in some ways. And therefore, we've started a ministry largely on the basis of evangelism in a place, if there's any place, at least in this country, that could be called postmodern, it would be that group of people. Young urban professionals, mainly in their 20s. And I would like to share with you something that is not, I don't know that this should be a book or anything like that, because in some ways what we've discovered does not quite fit in with what I'm reading in the books they say you're supposed to do in order to reach younger postmodern people. So I'm here to tell you my experience, and I think that it's got a lot of applicability, that's all. It's got a lot of applicability to anyone who's saying, how do we reach people who are the coming generation? How do we do evangelism? How do we reach out? Now, if you take the handout, let me start by giving you a little bit of kind of a thumbnail sketch of how the church plant went. My name's Tim Keller. I'm a graduate of Gordon-Conwell Seminary, but I was teaching at Westminster Seminary in the middle 80s, 1980s. In the late 80s, I was asked by my denomination, which is the Presbyterian Church in America, to research Manhattan for a church plant. In the middle of this first page, you'll see, in the middle of the paragraph under research, at the time when I went there, at the time, Manhattan south of 96th Street was approximately 15 square miles with 900,000 residents, 65% of which were living alone. That's one of the things I discovered in 1988, 89, that of the 900,000 residents, 65% of them were living by themselves in one-person units, which meant at least 65% of the people were single, unless for some reason a husband and wife decided to have apartments next to each other, but I don't think that was what happened. So at least 65% were single. So we had this enormous pile of young singles. Also, to my surprise, I discovered when I looked at the evangelical churches that were in Manhattan, I discovered that virtually all of them were commuter churches in which commuters were preaching to commuters. That is to say, I discovered that not only were the churches not filled with people who actually lived in the city, they tended to be working-class families from outside the city that commuted in, but the ministers themselves didn't live there, very often because they didn't feel they could afford it. So I did a little, how do you do demographics on Manhattan? If you take a look at the third paragraph on your first page, I said, no, actually the last paragraph, pardon me. See the last paragraph on the page? I basically came to realize there were 4 macro groups in Manhattan. Macro. You had the professional elites, young professionals, but not just young professionals, people who had made it in the corporate world, the creative world, so you had the professional elites. Secondly, you had all the new immigrants, people coming from other countries. They were the new working class. The New York Post and the Daily News in 1950, each of them had circulations of 2 million each. Today, the circulations of the Daily News and the New York Post are something like 200,000 to 300,000 each. Why? Because the working class doesn't read English. The working class are reading papers in their own language. So, for example, right now there's 18 daily newspapers published in New York City in Chinese. 18 dailies and that sort of thing. So you had the professionals, you had the immigrants, you had the poor, and then you have English-speaking middle-class people. English-speaking middle-class people, white and black. Now, if those 4, the elites, immigrants, the immigrant working class, the poor, and the English-speaking working class, of those 4 groups, 3 were growing and 1 was shrinking. You know which one was growing, which was shrinking? It was the English-speaking working class. They were leaving. The immigrants were coming. The professionals were coming. The poor were growing. And all the churches, all the evangelical churches were in this group. Black and white, largely evangelical churches. So I decided that we needed to plant churches in those other 3 groups, and the only one of those kinds of groups that I felt I personally could start a church on was the professionals. So we started a church in Manhattan. Turn over to page number 2, just to kind of complete the case study before I try to pull out some principles. Here's how I did it. Again, I don't know how many of you are actually planting churches or thinking of planting churches, but for 5 minutes I can tell you how we did it. The first step is you network, which is very simple. You sit down with a person and you ask 2 things. It doesn't matter whether they're Christian or non-Christian, as long as they live in Manhattan. And the first question is, what kind of church would really meet the needs of people in New York City or in Manhattan? What kind of church would people in Manhattan be helped by or challenged by? So you ask the question about that. And the second question is, who else could I ask this question to that would give me some good answers? Now, what that means is you get 2 things. You get information about the people. Whether the person's a Christian or non-Christian, you get ideas about the perceptions of the people and the needs of the people and so on. And the second thing you always get is a couple of their names. And it's sort of like a branch, because what happens is then you go see those 2 people, you ask the same 2 questions, and then, of course, now you have at least 5 or 6 names. Then you go to all 6 of them, and on it goes. Now, you do that over and over and over and over again all day in restaurants until they kick you out for seeing so many people. And you do this over and over again, and 2 things are occurring. One is you're getting a lot of information about the sort of church probably that you need to be planting. And the other is you're getting a mailing list of people that you update. Inside this group, I decided there were 3 kinds of people. There were Christians, longtime Christians. There were non-Christians, but in the middle there were new Christians. And there were various ministries around New York City that were producing new Christians. There were parachurch ministries. And if I could find a new Christian who hadn't become ensconced in any church yet, I discovered that is a person that had a lot of non-Christian friends. People who had been Christians for a long time, most of their friends were Christians. But people who were new Christians were enthusiastic about the new church, but also had a lot of non-Christian friends. So what I was really doing was, even though I was getting this long mailing list, what I was really looking for was to try to get to the place where I had at least 15 or 20 new Christians that said they'd like to be part of it. When that was done, we held what I call here a vision prayer group meeting. Now, a vision prayer group meeting was relatively simple. It was 2 hours long, and in the first half of the meeting, we would sit around. I didn't do a Bible study. I didn't do a study on what the church was going to be. The first half of the meeting, I said, tell me about your non-Christian friends, and let's create a profile. The profile is there on page 2. And we prayed for our non-Christian friends around that profile. The second half, we would study the Bible, and we would say, what kind of church do we want to start? And we would kind of put that together. And then at the end of that period, we would also pray for the church. So we prayed for the non-Christian friends, we prayed for the church. And each week, we did this for about 12 weeks, each week I would take notes on what people had suggested to me about how the church should be, how the individuals, what they were like. And I wanted to be not just a secretary, but a leader. So what I would do is people made all sorts of suggestions, and some of them contradicted one another. In fact, sometimes the same speaker contradicted him or herself during the meeting. So what I would do as a secretary is I would sort of drop out the things that I thought were kind of contradictory, lift up the comments and record the comments that I thought were helpful. And basically every week I would send out a newsletter to everybody saying, here's what we've decided the church should be like. Here are the various traits. And by the end of the prayer meeting, we came up with 3 things that we wanted to characterize our church. It's at the bottom of page 2 and the top of page 3. In fact, these 3 things are still driving the church. It's first, the bottom of page 2. By the way, do you have the same pages as I do, right?
You're one page behind.
I've always been one page behind David. Is this the bottom of page 3? I'll try to keep this in mind. Okay. Me plus 1 equals you. That's good. All right. Okay. Me plus 1 equals you, if I keep that up. Okay. Me plus 1. At the bottom of page 3, we want to not just be a congregation for ourselves, but also for our friends who do not yet believe in Christ at this point in their lives. Notice, this is not a secret church, but it's not a not-secret church. We don't want to be, we want to be not just a congregation for ourselves, but also for our friends who do not yet believe in Christ at this point in their lives. And behind this is the conviction that the gospel is the key to changing anyone. It's the thing that both believers and non-believers need to hear constantly in a service of worship, and we'll get back to that later, many times. Turn over to page 4. That's the first one. First is, we're not a church just for ourselves, but also for our friends who don't believe. Second, we want not to be just a ministry for ourselves, but also for the peace and benefit of the entire city. Our aim is not just a greater church, but a greater city. The aim of the church, this is Jeremiah 29. Seek the peace of the city, for if it prospers, you will prosper. And so he said, we're here not just to make ourselves, we're not just here as a bunch of yuppies to get inspiration to reach our yuppie goals and to live happy lives in our yuppie enclaves, but we're really here to have the gospel change us so the way in which we use our money and our power benefits the rest of the city. So we're going to care about the poor. We're going to be involved in ministries all throughout the city. So the first was, we're not just a church for ourselves, but for our friends who don't believe. Secondly, we're not just a church for ourselves, but for the whole city. Third, we don't want to just be a single church, but a movement of the gospel serving all churches and planting new churches. In other words, we don't want to just be a church, we want to be a movement. We do not just simply want to create one big church, but we would like to not only become a movement of dozens of churches, but we would also like to stimulate movements of evangelical churches of other traditions as well. So we're not here just to be a church, but to be a movement. We're not here just for ourselves, but for the city. We're not here just for ourselves, but for our friends. Those 3 convictions, which grew out of that first vision prayer meeting, are still with us. They're still the touchstones. They're still the things that we continually evaluate everything according to. You want to call that a vision statement? I'm just so tired of vision statements. I don't know what that is, but I do know, and it came out of our meeting in which we were thinking about what does God want for us. These are biblical things. Are they vision things? But there they are. They're the things. Now, our experience, let me look down here. Now I'll get back to most of the rest of this. You just need to know that we did start with about 40 non-Christians in 1989, probably new Christians. The new Christians, there were probably 60 people that as a result of the networking and as a result of the vision prayer meeting came to the first services. 40 of them were new Christians. About 20 or so were kind of Christians. But the new Christians brought an enormous number of non-Christian friends. And basically, the dynamic we had in the early days, which I wish we still had, we were not a famous church. Fortunately, I was not a famous pastor. And therefore, nobody, we rented facilities, so nobody could find Redeemer unless you were brought by someone, okay? So you only had really two kinds of people out there, the bringers and the brought. There really wasn't, you didn't have Christians who were dropping in. A wonderful thing. Because Christians who were dropping in we didn't have people visiting in the city. We certainly had no commuters. And we didn't even have Christians who had just moved to the city and decided to start coming. Because actually back in 1988, 89, 1990, that didn't happen. It's happening now, but it didn't happen. It was a much more dangerous and dark place. That was before the sitcom Friends came on. And ever since then, Christians have been moving to the city because they think it's cool. We had a modest, if you go over to page, the bottom of page 4 and the top of page 5, I think this is fair to say, I got an enormous amount of who I am came from my courses with Richard Lovelace when I was here. In 1972, the fall, I took the first course the first time he ever taught Dynamics of Spiritual Life was the fall of 1972, and I was in that course. And I took his course on Evangelical Awakenings. And what happened to us for the first 3 years, from 89 to about 92, was almost down the line a sweet and moderate but real version of what Lovelace showed me revival was. And what was it? Look at the, you see on page 5, there's the first full paragraph. Look at the last part of the first full paragraph. The last couple of sentences. This is my description of revival. During those first 3 years, there was the same feeling of inevitability that comes in times of awakening. The gospel seemed brand new. Sleepy and nominal Christians awoke with a start. People got converted every week. The air was charged with electricity. Every decision that the leaders made turned out to be wise. Everyone performed above and beyond their gifts and abilities. If you could control that, if you could can it, if you could bottle it, but that happens, and it did. And essentially we grew from zero. Don't forget, we didn't really have core people or families. We grew from 0 to 1,000 people coming in about 3 years. So I don't know what else you'd call it. And at the end of the 3 years, it was about 80% of the people who were coming lived in Manhattan, and 80% were single. The vital shot of Redeemer today, this is, okay. Let me give you a little snapshot of today, but then I want to extract principles for ministry, which in spite of the fact that you may not be in a city and you may not be church planting, I still think probably some of these principles are going to become more and more true as our culture moves in the direction. Before I give you a snapshot, I should just tell you, another great formative experience for me was accidentally. As a young man, I got called to be a professor of practical theology at Westminster Seminary in the mid-'80s. I was 33, 34, and I got dropped into a practical theology department with Roger Greenway, Edna Greenway, his wife, who's also on the faculty, Harvey Kahn, Bill Crispin. I don't know if you know those names or not, but those guys understood urban ministry, and in some ways they haven't been replaced. There's a whole generation of these prophets. Ray Bakke was another one of these guys of the same age who were trying to call the evangelical church to the city, and I was dropped in the middle of that department, and I learned an enormous amount from them about urban ministry, even though I wasn't doing urban ministry at the time. I caught the vision in some ways from them. But the one thing they told me, which is true, they said, we love cities, but LA and New York are always about 5 to 10 years ahead of the other cities. The hard thing to know is you don't know what parts of what's happening in LA and New York are so completely unique to them, and it will never happen anywhere else because there's no place like them. There's no place as big as them. You don't know which of those things that are happening in New York and LA are never going to happen anywhere else in the country, and you don't know which ones are definitely going to happen because they say whatever happens in New York and LA 5 or 10 years later is in the other big cities, 5 or 10 years later is happening in the culture as a whole. Though I think actually that's been sped up because of television, movies, and technology. They're right, and yet I have to be a little bit hesitant because I'm never completely sure what we have discovered in New York is applicable outside of New York and what's not. There's always got to be a little hesitancy. Nevertheless, let me share it with you. Oh, before I share you the principles, pardon me, page 5. Snapshot. Redeemer, I know you're going to ask these questions anyway, so, okay. 4,000 people are coming. You wanted to know that, right? You want to say, how big is Redeemer? See, that's the important thing. It's important. It's important to me. It's important, to understanding how it works. But 4,000 people come. At this point, we have 4 services. I preach on, as of next month, it will be. Let me tell you what it's going to be like next month, because it's always changing. 9:15 on the west side of Central Park, I preach a service. It's at the Ethical Culture Society, Central Park West, 64th Street. At 10:30 at Hunter College on the east side of the park, I preach a second service. At 5:45 in the evening at Hunter College on the east side, I preach an evening service. And at 7 o'clock on the west side at First Baptist at 79th and Broadway, I preach a fourth service. So there's 2 a.m. services, west side, east side, 2 p.m. services, east side, west side. Why am I doing that? Because when I believe megachurches are unstable compounds. I believe, I was talking with my friends the Davids about this a minute ago. I believe this is what megachurches grow because God in His providence sort of prepares a situation, and the founder comes in, and voila, the founder is just the right person at the right time and the right people, and it kind of explodes. But it's very hard to succeed somebody like that. For example, if the next pastor comes in to try to succeed me and preach to 4,000 or 5,000 people, and if he has more hair than me, some people are going to say, it's just not working for me. I just can't receive the Word of God from somebody with that much hair. People just get so completely fixated on just the quirks and the tics and so on. Our idea is that Redeemer is an incubator, a temporary incubator, to spawn what we hope will be eventually 25 daughter churches. We've started 11. And eventually, those 4 congregations, because they're in different locations and they're kind of developing their own demographic, that when I pull out of all of them, when I retire, each of them will call its own pastor. So that out of the megachurch will come something like 25 or 30 urban churches. And that's the plan. At this point, by the way, the other thing you should know is it's still 70 to 80% single. So believe it or not, Redeemer is got 4,000 people coming to it, actually more right now, and it's still 75 to 80% single. And if somebody says, how did you get all those single people? The answer is it's an odd spot. It's Manhattan, and that's who lives there, and we're just preaching the gospel, and of course you're going to get, if in Manhattan is 60, 75% single, you're going to get 75% single people. So there it is. Now, what do we learn? Just watching. I want to make sure I have time for questions, because you're not going to warm up till we start to hear each other. You should be on page 6. Okay. Page 6, me plus 1 equals you, 6. Okay. Let me give you, here's some principles. I still think that these are probably going to be increasingly applicable for people, whether you're in a city or not. I'm going to put the first 2 together, reciprocal love for the city and positive attitude to the city. In general, well, look here, I'm not going to read you this part. I'll read you some of them. One of the things I discovered was that the average evangelical church in New York City was filled with people who hated the city. And the preachers hated the city. So basically, the worship services went like this. Isn't it awful we have to be here, but let's huddle together in this cold place and try to become spiritually warm. And I came to realize that if you hate the city and you hate everything about it, how expensive it is, how crime-ridden it is, how secular it is, you attract people who are only going to be there as long as they absolutely have to be. And an awful lot of these ministers complain about the incredible turnover in their churches. And by the way, it is a terrible problem in cities, but to some degree it's because they only attracted people who wanted to leave. Now, I think that's actually something, let me go a step further. It's very, very easy for evangelicals in general to spend a great deal of time because the pastors are themselves so alienated from the culture around them, see so little common grace in the culture around them, are so negative about the culture around them that they actually attract only people who are incredibly alienated from the culture as well. And what that almost becomes eventually is a barrier. And the barrier is, there's a lot of non-Christians out there who hate the culture too. There are a lot of them. There's a place where Michael, I'll get to it later on, Michael Wolff of New York Magazine said, you've got a conservative, you've got the nation that watches Fox News. Most of them probably aren't Christians, but they like to think about how secular the country is and how we've lost our moral bearings and so forth. And I came to realize that there are a lot of non-Christians out there who already hate the culture, and they need to be saved. And they need to hold on to their paper too. They need to be saved. However, if you create an environment in which you only attract people who are very unhappy about their culture, you've really limited your mission field. You can only save conservative people. You can only win to Christ people who are already traditional, already conservative. So I came to realize that wasn't very practical to grump about the city, but not only from the pulpit, but even in the kind of wisecracks and jokes and statements that were spoken and said in the small groups or in informal conversations. So if you go back to page 6, we decided to develop our biblical resources that were there to have a positive view of the city. You see where it says positive attitude toward the city, the middle of the paragraph? We developed theological and biblical studies. We looked at Jeremiah 29, many other similar passages. Now, by the way, by a positive view of the city, I got this from Harvey Kahn. Harvey sort of reworked the Niebuhr things, and said, you've got Christ against the city churches, who basically saw the city as being all evil. And then you had Christ of the city churches, which were the liberal churches that just celebrated everything out there. And then you had churches that didn't hate the city and they didn't accept the city. They loved the city. They loved the city transformatively. And he says, whatever that means, I know it's not easy to get that right, but that's what you've got to do, and that's what we try to do. Extremely important to talk the city up, to be positive about the city, to only hire staff members who were energized by the city, not drained by it, who liked it, who were willing to live in the heart of it. That was number one. Now, I think that'll apply even if you don't live in cities. You have to ask yourself, what is our attitude toward the culture? Do we have a balanced understanding of its sin and its common grace? I don't know. Number one. Number two, living where you minister. Generally speaking, I have discovered that Christians are so middle class that ministers refuse to live. If ministers had poor congregations, they refused to live amongst the poor, but they would commute in from safer neighborhoods. And if ministers had churches in very affluent places, very often they commuted in from more affordable places, not safer places. Because I came to realize in New York, see, there are no middle-class people in New York. Everybody's rich or poor. And I came to realize that Christians hate both those groups of people. They really do. They sneer at the rich. They say, how could anybody spend this kind of money on a house when all those missionaries could have been sent? And so there's a self-righteousness toward the rich, and there's a self-righteousness toward the poor. This is a free country. Why can't you pull yourself up by your own bootstraps? I mean, go get a job. And we came to realize that partly because of that, we found our people were not willing to live in their neighborhoods. They stayed there. And also, I discovered when I first got there that all the ministers, the Seventh-day Adventist church that we rented, the minister lived in Pennsylvania. This was in the Upper East Side, 111 East 87th Street. And when I was there, the first minister was there. 2 years later, a new minister came along, and he lived in Massapequa, which was in 2 hours away in Long Island. Generally speaking, that people disdained and did not want to live and incarnate in the place where they lived, where the people were supposed to live. Because the ministers didn't hang out with the people who lived in the neighborhood, because the ministers didn't read their magazines, because the ministers didn't know what was on their hearts, their sermons didn't connect with them. And because their sermons didn't connect with them, they didn't come. Oddly enough, grumpy, alienated people who commuted into the city. If they're the preachers, next thing you know, there's nobody out there in the pews except grumpy, alienated people who don't live in the city as well. So we discovered you have to live where you minister. Number 3, a de-middle-class gospel. Again, I think this is going to be more and more true as we go on. What I mean by a de-middle-class gospel, I was raised in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I was raised in an Anglo-American middle-class culture, and these were the emphases in my house. Sentimental language was good. Lack of communicative directness was good. You get into New York and you get communicative directness, but we weren't used to that. Control of your emotions was good. General tidiness and order. A barely disguised disdain for both poor and the social elite, and an absolute love for the obvious in art. If it's going to be art, I want to know exactly what you're saying. You know that great. Of course, artists absolutely hate that. You know the place where somebody asked Flannery O'Connor, he said, Flannery O'Connor, I don't understand that short story. Could you just give, in a nutshell, what's the moral of the story? What was that story about in a nutshell? And she said, you know what she said, right? If I could give it in a nutshell, I wouldn't have had to write the story. So anyway. When I got to New York and people started becoming Christians who were not middle class, they didn't have all these attributes. And this actually made those of us who were from middle-class backgrounds kind of unhappy at first. And then we had to adjust. And if you go to the top of page 7, here's how we had to do it. We had to make, and I think this may be also true in churches as time goes on. Number 1, we decided to be committed to excellence in communication, but to avoid physical polish and slickness, as you can tell by looking up here. No, never mind. Commitment to excellent, normal middle-class sense of financial proportion had to change. We spent a ton of money on certain things. We spent a ton of money on printed material, on media presentations, on learning and teaching resources. They had to be extremely well done. They had to be top of the line. And all your presentations had to be extremely logical, extremely rational, to the point. They had to be great. On the other hand, we found that younger generations and Northeasterners in general were skeptical of the well-dressed, well-coiffed, perfectly manicured, spotlessly dressed office facilities and staff, where all the meetings were always done with sentimentality, lack of communicative directness, control of emotions, general tidiness and order. And we just threw those over. We decided we can't be polished and slick, but we have to be very, very smart. But most of all, and I'll get to this the next time, not after the in talk number 2, avoidance of the jargon. Evangelical church has developed an enormous amount of cliche and terminology, which is a form of tribal language. If you're not used to it, it strikes you immediately. But we're so used to it, and just the way we do opening remarks, it's just astounding. We'll get back to it later. It's completely opaque to the outside world. We relentlessly work on simplicity of speech rather than jargon, joyful realism rather than sentimentality. Be happy. Don't tell people how they have to be feeling. I took a course with Elizabeth Elliott here years ago on, I've forgotten the name of it. She probably taught it here for quite a number of years, but she always pressed the difference between bathos and pathos in speech and writing. And what's the difference between bathos and pathos? She says, if you're a good writer, you don't say, it was an exciting waterfall. That's sentimental language. That's telling the reader how they have to feel. And, she would say, it's lazy. You're telling the reader how they have to feel instead of describing the waterfall so they get excited. See, it's one thing to say they ought to be excited. And see, sentimentality is saying, isn't the Lord just great? That's sentimental. Just don't do that in Manhattan. Isn't the Lord just wonderful? Why don't you say that in Manhattan? They say, well, I don't know if he's wonderful or not. Help me. See, the worship leader, that's bathos. It's not pathos. The worship leader is relying on sentimentality instead of actually presenting the Lord in such a way that the listener gets excited and thinks he is wonderful. It's a shortcut. It's lazy. You see? So these are small things They're incredibly important amongst people who are not raised in that kind of tribal language. Let's keep going. I've got to give you the rest of these here so we can ask some questions. This is on page 7. You see where it says, speak to your whole community, not just the ones in the seats? This is extremely important, everybody. If I preach as if non-Christians are present, now I'm going to talk about this all day if you're willing to stay. If I preach as if non-Christians are present, that is to say, if I take their objections into consideration. So, for example, if I'm saying, now the Bible is the inspired Word of God. If I don't have an aside, if I say now, if I don't do something like this, if I don't say, now look, friends, I know some of you think that's an outrageous statement, but would you please consider this? So if I don't show that I notice that they're there, and if I don't show a certain amount of respect, at least an understanding for their point of view. If I just say the Bible is the inspired Word of God, and I don't make any reference to the fact that most people think that's a stupid idea, then anyone who's out there who does think it's a stupid idea will feel like I'm saying all intelligent people know that, and nobody else really matters. I need to preach as if they're there. I need to notice them. I need to think about their concerns. I need to not use we-them language. I should not talk as if non-Christians aren't present. Never, ever, ever, ever. If I preach as if non-Christians are present, they will be brought. Because the Christians present know, even if a preacher is edifying them, that their non-Christian friends would be confused or offended. See, Christians, I think the average Christian goes to a church where they say, I really get a lot out of this minister, but I couldn't bring my non-Christian friends because they'd be confused or offended. Why? The minister doesn't preach as if any non-Christians are present. Why? Because there aren't any. But that's the reason there aren't any. If you preach as if they're not there, they'll never be brought. Christians just instinctively know. If you preach as if they are there, even if they're not there, they will be there. Got it? Very important. I mean, if it's one thing you're going to remember from today, if you remember this, it'll probably be worth it. Well, maybe not. Maybe you need one more thing to make it worth it. Another thing we say in the city, now, again, if you're not in a small group, you're not in a church. Now, what does that mean? In a very mobile society, you can't visit people in Manhattan because they're always changing where they live. Every time you say, oh, I know so-and-so, she lives right around the corner over here, and say, oh, no, she moved. And every 6 months, everybody moves. And they're always traveling. And they're always traveling around the world, and they're always traveling different places. Now, how do you keep in touch with people pastorally? When I had a church in Hopewell, Virginia for 10 years, small groups are very important for discipleship and training because there's a lot of things you can only learn in more of a community than in a classroom. But when it came to pastoral nurture, everybody in Hopewell, Virginia had always lived in Hopewell, Virginia. They're still there. I had my church from 1975 to 1984. And all my best friends from that church from 1975 to 1984, they still live there. Because when you lose a job in Hopewell, you don't go somewhere else to get a job. You wait until you can find another job in Hopewell. Why would you want to live somewhere else? Everybody else is here. My brothers, my sisters, my father, my mother, we were all here. So that's not New York. Small groups were not very important in Hopewell. But here's what we say in New York City, is what I say. I say, if you're a member of this church and you get sick or you get in the hospital or something like that, we're going to do everything we possibly can to respond to you. But I'd like to say something. If you're not in a small group, you're not on our radar screen. Because you see, every month we meet with our small group leaders. They tell us what's happening in the groups. And therefore, if you're not in a group and something goes wrong in your life and the pastors don't respond to you, I don't want to hear any complaints because you've been warned. You're not on our radar screen. We're going to do it. If you're not in a group and you're a member and something goes wrong, we owe you our pastoral care. We'll give it to you as fast as we possibly can. But if it's slower than you would like, don't complain because you have fair warning. If you're not in a group, don't expect the pastoral response to be very quick. We cannot keep on top of people. We can't know when people are here and they're not here. We can't know what's going on in their lives. There can't be any discipline without small groups because we don't know enough about what's happening in your life. So we press small groups, as you can tell. And the more mobile and the more urban the place, the more important small groups is for pastoral care, not just training and discipleship. Bottom of page 7, counterintuitive holistic ministry. Turn over to the top of page 8, please, because I'm asking you to. and then I'm done, actually, unless you ask me about the last part. There are two sides to the gospel's influence, as far as I can see. On the one hand, the gospel is, I'm saved not because of what I have done, but by what Jesus has done. What that does is that creates an identity transformation. The identity transformation means that my self-image, my identity factor is no longer based on my achievement or my status. Now, two things happen. It's based on what Jesus has done for me. On the one hand, what that really means is I don't identify as much with my race as I used to. I don't identify as much with my social class as I used to. I don't look down my nose at people who I think are beneath me like I used to. It does have social impact. It also has a psychological impact. That is to say, I'm not as afraid of what people think of me in general. I'm not as afraid of... So what does that mean? The gospel should make you much more able to share your faith courageously, and it should make you much more concerned about the needs of people not in your race or social class. And I think that means that in a church that's really thinking out the implications of the gospel, I'll actually read you this. You see this? It's the first full paragraph on page 8. These two sides of the gospel's influence create a unique kind of church. And this, I can't tell you how important this has been in New York. So many fundamentalist churches tend to be legalistic in their approach, even if they technically believe in justification by faith. Technically, they believe you're saved by faith, but in actuality, functionally, they believe you're saved because you're doing everything according to the rules. Therefore, though they stress evangelism, they're not all that attractive or effective. They only do evangelism. They're not really concerned about the poor, but their evangelism very often isn't very winsome because of the legalism. Okay? On the other hand, many, many liberal churches, though they stress social justice, are not at all effective in it, and I'll tell you why. Social justice, social concern, working with the poor is really hard work. Unless you've had an absolutely transforming experience of the new birth and conversion, I think you give up on it. Their people's lives are not electrified by conversion. They do not have deep experiences that humble them and change the way they look at the poor. Therefore, I'm just reading now, a gospel-centered church should have social justice emphasis and an effectiveness in that greatly exceeds the liberal churches. Has to be. Meanwhile, it should have an evangelistic fervor and winsomeness that greatly exceeds the ordinary fundamentalist churches. Has to be. A gospel-centered church should combine zeals that ordinarily are never, ever seen together in the same church. And this is one of the main ways you make people in New York think twice. Because they desperately want to put you on a spectrum. They want to stick you in a category, and they can't do it. Needless to say, this can't come from any direct kind of competitive comparing ourselves with others. In other words, you never look at other churches around the city and try to outdo their program. That's not the issue. We're not going to win people to Christ because we've got a greater children's ministry. Why? Because nobody's got children. We're not going to do it because we've got great parking. We have no parking. On the other hand, nobody's got cars. Those things don't matter. This is what matters. And I think increasingly it will matter out in suburbia where people probably overemphasize the children's programs and the parking. Maybe not. So, summary. And if this is too fast for you, don't worry. If you're staying, we have 3 more talks in which I'm going to flesh this out. On page 7, here's the summary of what I think I've learned and what I think can be applied. Oh, did I say 7? Yeah. Page 8. 8. Can you imagine 2 axes like this, like this? One axis is what I'm going to call the gospel axis. The gospel must not be communicated one click toward moralism or one click toward relativism. The gospel is, I'm accepted through Christ, therefore I obey. Every other religion operates on the principle, I obey, therefore I'm accepted. Luther's fundamental insight, and of course this was driven into me by Lovelace in all my courses with him, was that the principle, I obey, therefore I'm accepted, is the deep default mode of the heart. The principle of religion is in there, and even after I get converted, my heart still goes back to it. Now, what I'm going to try to show you in the future, this is what this means. This means that, well, let me just get right to the chase. If you're in ministry, a lot of you are, a lot of you aren't. If you're in ministry, do you not know that you get far more of your joy and sense of self-worth out of the success of your ministry than you do out of the fact that you're loved by God through Jesus in Jesus Christ? You get far more of your sense of significance and self-worth out of your ministry success than out of who you are in Christ. And if you don't know that, you're in trouble. But that's why you overwork. That's why you get devastated with criticism. That's why ministers are control freaks. That's why very often churches blow up. Now, what does this mean? What this means is, what do you need as a minister? Do you need, fundamentally, a course on time management? Sure. Do you need a course on conflict resolution? Sure. How to handle criticism? Sure. But ultimately, you don't actually believe the gospel. The reason why you're overworking, the reason why all these problems are happening in your life is this. The default mode of your heart is, because I'm getting all this done, because my church is growing, because all these things are happening, I'm accepted. Not I'm accepted, therefore I'm ministering. I'm ministering, therefore I'm accepted. I minister, therefore I am. Now, therefore, ultimately, if you the ministers, if you know that the most fundamental of your need of your heart, underneath all the time management techniques and all that, is that you actually don't believe the gospel. You believe it at one level, but you don't actually believe it. If that's the case, then what do you need each week in your worship service? You need to hear the gospel. Fundamentally, you need the gospel again, applied to your issue. But that's what the non-Christian needs to hear. The gospel. In fact, the postmodern non-Christian needs to hear the gospel in multiple perspectives. Needs to see how the gospel applies to a person who overworks. Needs to see how the gospel applies to conflict resolution. Needs to see how the gospel applies. And the gospel is the fundamental need of the heart for both Christians and non-Christians. If you get that, if you figure that out, then your preaching will not be moralistic, which is to say, well, you were saved by the gospel, but now we're going to go ahead and show you how you can raise your children for Christ, and here's these principles for raising families successfully. See, that kind of sermon will bore the non-Christians because they don't even believe Christianity, so how could they be interested in a sermon about raising your children for Christ? But if you have figured out how to show parents that the reason why they're having trouble with their children is at some level they don't believe the gospel, and at the very end of whatever else you're saying, you're applying the gospel to being a parent, then the non-Christian hears the gospel every week. The Christian hears the gospel every week. Your preaching is not moralistic, but obviously it's not relativistic. To the degree you're able to preach the gospel each week, not a click toward moralism, not a click toward relativism, your ministry changes lives. The other axis, though, so here's one axis, not legalism, not relativism, right here. Here's the other axis. You have to contextualize your ministry, and we'll talk about this later. You have to adapt to your culture, but not too much. If you adapt too much of the culture you're trying to reach, you buy into their idols, right? But if you adapt too little to the culture you're trying to reach, you buy into your own. Because your own culture, where you are, there is no such thing as a decontextualized gospel. Every kind of Christianity is in a culture. Therefore, if you're able to minister, not too adapted, not too unadapted. If you don't adapt enough, people won't even understand what you're saying. If you over-adapt, you actually won't convert them. You'll just be kind of sprinkling Christian dust on their current cultural idols and goals. And therefore, I would say, the ministry must be not one click over-adapted to the culture or one click under-adapted. Now, I know that's silly in a way, because nobody's right here, is it? Not legalistic, not moral, not relativistic, not under-adapted, not over-adapted, but to the degree you can get into ground zero, to the degree you can get into the center, to that degree, your ministry will change lives, transform the culture. And that's your effort, and that's what I found. And of course, I'm not saying, and I have done it. Of course, that's just silly. In fact, I could tell you how far up in which direction we're going, but that's another sort of story. So I think we got about 10 or 15 minutes to have some questions. So is there anything you would like to ask about the case study? These are general principles. And what I'm going to do later is we'll talk a little bit about evangelism and contextualization, a little bit about worship and contextualization, a little bit about how to preach in the way I've been talking about. Yes?
You've been speaking about being a pastor, and as a pastor, how do you spend your time? Who do you spend your time with? And to be effective, has that changed during your ministry?
I love it when I can say, I'll get to that after, in the second talk.
Okay.
But in general, I've got to keep a certain number of non-Christians in my regular appointments. I should always be talking to non-Christians. And if leaders and Christians appointments squeeze them out, I've got to get them back. I mean, that's the shortest answer. In the early days, there wasn't anybody else hardly. In the early days, I spent so much time talking to non-Christians. I'll talk to you about what an impact that had on me. But even now, I have to work on that. But we'll talk about it more. Other questions? Yes.
Noticing a statistic that 45% of the congregation is Asian American.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you about that growth that you had in the first 3 years when you went from 0 to 1,000. What percentage of that growth is Asian?
It's always been probably 25 to 45%.
So from the very beginning,
Yeah.
the growth was kind of parallel.
Yeah. Again, that might be... No, I can talk to you about it now. It has always been. It's about 13% Chinese, 23% Korean. It's been that way for many, many, many years. Do you have any questions about that?
I do.
Yes, go ahead.
One question that I had was, and no disrespect or anything that's kind of been talked about.
No, sure.
I think it's incredible some of the stuff that's happened there. But one of the things I'm wondering is, was there kind of an opportune moment, especially the decade of the late 80s and the early 90s, where there was a significant number of disenfranchised Asian Americans who were emerging out of the Korean and Chinese church context, where they felt no connection to their parents' culture and needing a place where the gospel was communicated in the language of their choice, which was English.
Right.
And the lack of existing ministries for the second generation of Americans. And so if half of the church is coming out of that movement, was it meeting that particular movement as a factor
Perhaps.
in addition to some of the other stuff, which I think is valid?
Yeah, I bet you, well, as a matter of fact, next, at the second talk on evangelism, I'll break out 8 subgroups. Because I'm talking, when you think yuppie, you're thinking of one kind of person, but there's at least 8 subgroups in there. But I can tell you this. There were 2 reasons, because I continually had Asian pastors showing up on my doorstep saying, how are you getting these people here? We can't keep them, we can't win them. A lot of them became critics. See, what happened was an awful lot of Chinese and Korean folks that ended up in my church were English-speaking, but they were raised in churches where everything was in the mother tongue. And their mother tongue wasn't very good in many cases. Many cases they weren't bilingual. So what that really meant was they got up and they went off to college and they weren't Christian. They really hadn't heard it. They only had very vague, that was part of the problem, was that they actually did not, since they hadn't heard it in their mother language, in many cases they just barely understood what was going on. But the two issues, one is, whereas their parents, all of their friends were Asian. The kids, half of their friends are non-Asian. How can you bring my non-Asian, non-Christian friends to an Asian church? In other words, they couldn't do evangelism in an all-Asian church because half of their friends were not Asian. That was the first problem. In other words, the first issue was, okay, here's a young Korean man. He goes off to Harvard, comes back to New York. His parents, all their friends are Korean, so if they want to bring their non-Christian friends to church, there's a Korean church. But now he works at Wall Street, and he's got a lot of Korean friends, but he's got a lot of non-Korean, non-Asian friends. If he wants to bring them to church, what's he going to do? Bring them to the Korean church? They couldn't do it very easily. That was the first problem. The second problem was epistemology. The Asian culture is more corporate and collective, and the Western culture is more individual. So here's what happened. The kids would grow up and they'd say to their parents, why should I be a Christian? And the parents gave them a collectivistic answer. They'd say, well, we're your people, and we are a Christian people, and we are a Christian church, and we are your family, and we're a Christian family. But see, they sent the kids off to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, where the education taught them to ask for reasons. Well, why is Christianity true? But that's not how the parents thought. The parents said, we're part of a group and we're Christians. And so they come to Redeemer, and I'm not assuming the collectivistic mindset. I'm giving them reasons. So I would say that Asian American pastors who want an Asian American church in English couldn't meet the first need anyway. You almost have to have a multi-ethnic church to help young Asians in a multi-ethnic situation evangelize their friends. In the second case, they could have made that change, and a lot of them are. So there are a number of Asian American pastors who are doing Asian American churches in which they're giving people reasons for Christianity different than the way they were given in the Asian church. But I would say, generally speaking, what you need is multi-ethnic churches. In other words, my church is now a multi-ethnic church run by a white guy. And we need Asian-led multi-ethnic churches and African-American-led multi-ethnic churches. We need that increasingly as the kids get educated. What happens is the college education pulls kids into a more of a multi-ethnic situation with their friendships. Any of them that go off to college, that's what happens. Then it gets a little harder for them to bring their friends back into a mono-ethnic situation, and that's the reason why I'd say the churches that are thriving in the city are the churches, English-speaking churches that are thriving in the city, are the ones that have a bias toward being multi-ethnic as much as possible. It's even true of African-American churches. The newer African-American churches tend to be more multi-ethnic. They're African-American-led. They mix in the Caribbean and the Africans as well as African-Americans. They mix in Hispanics. They mix in some Asians and Anglos. They're the ones that are growing. The ones that are more traditionally monocultural and completely mono-ethnic are having trouble, if they're English-speaking. If you're working in another language, they can still thrive. Any follow-up questions? I'm not sure if I'm...
There are larger issues, I think, in terms of...
Much. Well, I'm just answering why we got that crowd.
It's more like where's the identity portion of it as well? Formation of identity.
Yeah, no. Big.
Part of it, not just the common space occupied.
Well, right. That's right. Of course, the Anglos in the church, our identity has been going through some transformations too. So if you're in a multi-ethnic church, no matter who you are, you're not really staying quite the same as you were. Just for your information, we are probably the largest Asian American church in the country. If you have 4,200 people coming, you're talking about a huge. We're bigger than any English-speaking ministry of any Asian church. We're also the largest Jewish Christian church in the country. Mitch Glazer, just interesting. Mitch Glazer, who used to be with Jews for Jesus. Some of you may know him. He works for Chosen People now. Jewish Christian missionary, says he thinks there's at least 300 or 400 Christian Jewish people in Redeemer, which is, again, it's in New York. I mean, if you're going to win people to Christ, you're going to win Jewish people to Christ. But he says there's no Jewish Christian, no Messianic synagogues, no Jewish Christian churches that big. And we weren't trying. We're just in New York. And we weren't trying to reach Asian Americans. We're just trying to reach who's in the neighborhood. And Asian Americans and singles and Jewish people are just there. That's it. So we're targeting. By the way, we do target, but we target a geography rather than a demographic. Now we have to be smart about who's in the geography, demographically, but we don't target. You see what I'm saying? Okay, let's keep going. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
What's the nature of these other churches that you are planting and sort of directly as Redeemer and as women? Not to say the ones that you're sort of resourcing in addition to that, but the ones you're planting, that is, do they reflect what Redeemer is now, or do they develop in their own uniqueness as they're going along?
It's a great question, and I think when I answer this, David, I'll turn it back to you, right? Because this is the end. We need a break now, but 5 M's. 5 M's. Money, members, minister, mentoring, and model. Okay? If you give all 5 M's to a church, that's a daughter church. We give them the minister, we give them most of the money, we give them some of our members, we heavily mentor them, and they basically work off of Redeemer's model. The things that the holistic approach, the positive view of the city approach, emphasis on small groups, the understanding of worship, and so on, which we'll get to later. That's a daughter church, and we want to have 25 of them. We have about 11. We want 3/4 of them to be in the city, but we do want to start suburban churches because we don't want them to come in. So we don't want the suburbanites to come in. We want them to have churches in their area. So we have to do that. Then there's a second group, which is basically Presbyterian churches that are not right on our model. So, for example, we've done at least another 20 Presbyterian churches. Many of them are in non-English speaking, okay, where we would fund a pioneer or help a Chinese church plant a daughter Chinese church and that sort of thing. But we have a partner program, and a partner program is where we take any evangelical church in the city, because we really aren't here just to increase our tribe. We know something, and that is New York City is not going to be changed just through Presbyterian churches. It's just no way that most people in New York are going to go to Presbyterian churches. So what we have said is, if you really care about the city, we have said, if you're an evangelical church, so there are some doctrinal boundaries, we will give you $5,000 to $10,000 in free mentoring and consultation to help you start your church. Locate it, assess, the minister, and that sort of thing. And we did 12 last year, and we're doing 24 next year. And these are not, for example, PCA, we do not believe in the ordination of women, but we are training an African-American Pentecostal woman pastor in Staten Island to plant a church, because she's part of the family, part of the body, and part of New York. We have helped Assembly of God churches start Assembly of God churches with our money, and with our because we want all of New York to become a faith-filled city, and that means the number of churches has to grow in New York something like 50% over the next 50 years. So, see, A, B, and C, daughter churches, you might say sort of associated churches and partner churches. So church planting, the reason I just took a little extra time on that was because I didn't really bring this up as one of our major themes, because I'm not sure everybody has to do it, but for us it's very, very important. I was trying to give you themes that I thought would apply across the board.